Hello and welcome to this session titled On the Hedge, Systematic Risk Reduction, Current Events and Updates from FP Climate with Johannes Akva and Stan Pinsent. I'm Max and I'll be the MC for this session. Following the presentation, we'll move on to a live Q&A session where Johannes and Stan will respond to your questions. You can submit questions through Swapcard live discussion feature. Then, after 50 minutes, we'll bring the session to an end. But first, I'd like to introduce our speakers for the session. Johannes Akva is a researcher at Founders Pledge, where he leads the Climate Change Fund. Prior to joining Founders Pledge, Johannes spent 5 years working at a think tank advising decision-making makers on climate policy and conducting academic research into the intersection between effective and feasible climate policies. Stan Pinsent is a researcher at Founders Pledge on the climate team, where he works on prioritization methodology. Previously, he was a researcher at the Center for Exploratory Altruism Research, where he specialized in global mental health. So, without further ado, please welcome Johannes and Stan.
Yeah, thank you so much, Max, and thank you all for coming today. Can you all see the screen well? Is my screen shared? Yeah. Okay, yeah, so welcome to this very special edition of our climate talk this year on the hedge, systematic climate reduction, the 2024 elections, and climate philanthropy. And yeah, so we're going to talk about the US elections and their consequences for climate action, really kind of trying to answer the question, what's the environment that we'll be operating in as climate philanthropists over the next 4 years? Then we're going to talk about philanthropic preparedness and responses. What can we do? What are other people doing? What should we be doing more of? And then we'll talk about broader lessons. What does this teach us about climate and philanthropy at large, how things have been going? And yeah, to really start with the US elections, the US elections, the 2024 elections, if we kind of go back before the elections, essentially at the beginning of the year, it has always been framed as a really like a high stakes gamble, right? So that there'd be a very, very stark difference between different outcomes. So here's a tweet from Hillary Clinton, which kind of retweeted a canonical analysis on this from Carbon Brief, and it's titled, "What's at stake at climate for our climate in this November? Absolutely everything." And there's a very strong difference between then the Biden scenario and the Trump scenario. So the stakes seem to be very high or are very high. What are the stakes? First, there are the direct domestic effects. And of course, now we're talking after the election. So we're kind of in the scenario that people at that time were kind of worrying about, right? The Trump scenario and indeed kind of a Trump trifecta scenario. So the direct domestic effects, if Trump were to fully repeal Biden's climate policies, the effect could be something like 1 gigaton a year, which would be something on the order of 20% of US emissions or about 2% of global emissions. So this would be quite significant. But if you've ever been to a Founders Pledge presentation before, you know that the primary reason we care about the US is not the US territorial emissions, but rather the US is kind of like a leading economy when it comes to clean tech innovation. So the majority of climate impacts or of the impacts of US climate policy and what's going to happen to it in the next 4 years are going to be international and indirect, because they're going to shape the technological trajectory for many nascent clean energy technologies. So those will probably be larger than the domestic effects, even though they're highly uncertain. Then, of course, there are going to be like global effects that are really directly related to international policy. So I can't see the timer running. Max, can you confirm that everything's going well? Yeah, sorry. Okay, so then there are going to be a global effect and the Paris Agreement. So yeah, the Paris Agreement, Trump famously exited the Paris Agreement when he was first in office, and he campaigned on leaving the Paris Agreement again, and was right now kind of the main topic in US climate policy, which is, in international climate policy, which is climate finance, increasing climate finance to developing countries, essentially rich countries, subsidizing poorer countries to do the clean energy transition. I think it's kind of hard to imagine a policy that is kind of less aligned with typical priorities we would expect from President-elect Trump. So there's going to be global effects as well. And then there are a lot of known unknowns. So until now, I've kind of talked about climate policy. That is kind of climate policy by intention, but climate policy is only a small part of overall policy. And oftentimes emissions trajectories or climate dynamics are affected by policies that are actually not climate policies. So if you think about the agenda of President-elect Trump, tariffs are a big thing here, political signaling, right? So like someone running kind of on a populist anti-climate agenda kind of has repercussions internationally. And then of course, geopolitical repercussions. So those are not climate policies, but they could kind of dwarf climate policies and their emission impacts. And yeah, what I really wanted you to take away from this kind of as the bottom line, the effects could be very large. The stakes are high, but they're also highly uncertain, right? So like they could be smaller, they could be larger, and they will be dominated by those effects that are more uncertain, but harder to measure by the global effects. Okay, so yeah, we've been thinking about this for the past year a lot, and we've been kind of trying to think about what's going to be priorities in different scenarios in the Democratic presidency, if Harris had won, and the Republican presidency with divided government. So if Democrats had held to one chamber of Congress, or then in the scenario, which is the scenario that we actually ended up in, where Republicans hold a trifecta. So they not only control the presidency, but also both houses of Congress, namely the Senate and the House of Representatives. So that's the scenario that we actually ended up in. What are going to be the key issues kind of in the next year or over the next 4 years? And we don't have time to go through all 4, so I'll just choose 2. So the first one is kind of about defending clean energy, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is kind of the signature climate bill, the largest kind of climate bill the US has ever passed, and arguably the largest climate policy that has ever been passed globally. So that will kind of be in defense mode, because next year there's going to be the Trump tax cuts going to be renegotiated because they're expiring next year, and Trump will want to renew his tax cuts. So there's going to be pressure, and not all of the tax credits will likely survive, or there will be a lot of political battle. So that will be kind of like one of the major battlefields for climate action next year. And I think the question we ought to ask there is like, which of those tax credits will survive, if any? Another one, and this is actually something which is like a little bit more on the offense side of climate policy, so not kind of defending existing progress, but unlocking additional progress. So the biggest issue right now holding back clean energy is that it's hard to build things, so that permitting reform is kind of a suite of policies that kind of helps make it easier to build. This is something that was discussed in the past. This might have been passed in a different way, in a different electoral scenario. Republicans in general are very interested in that, in permitting reform, but obviously Republicans, when they talk about permitting reform, focus on a broad suite of energy, not only clean energy. So this also makes it easier to build fossil fuels. And so I think the question there to ask is, I mean, first of all, will some form of permitting reform pass, but also what will the net effects be for clean energy versus dirty energy? One could be a little bit hopeful there, at least if policy, if clean tech policy remains in place, because right now, most energy that's actually stuck in the pipeline is clean energy. So if it's kind of easier to rebuild, everything's going to be rebuilt, but there's going to be more clean than dirty. That would be the optimistic case there. Yeah, so lots of climate and energy policy will happen in 2025, and there will be lots of variance in how this goes. It's very uncertain how this goes. And yeah, to kind of zoom in a little bit, going from policy to politics, how does the situation look like? Well, obviously, as we all know, Trump won the White House, even with a popular vote, so he can kind of claim a mandate that is larger than what he had before. The Senate leans towards Republican, 53-47. The House is not finally counted, but it's probably going to be 2020 to 2021 Republicans versus 2014 to 2015 Democrats. So this is a much narrower margin, and this is actually the more narrow margin. The Supreme Court, obviously heavily Republican. Overall, we can kind of say this is the most Republican-dominated political scenario in a generation, at least. So at least since 2004. So when Bush kind of won re-election handily, probably even longer than that. So it's a very Republican-leaning scenario. But still, the majorities are narrow, and this will make most politics bipartisan. So to give a sense of why that is, right? So the House majority is going to be less than 10 votes, and historically, the Republican House has not been super disciplined over the last couple of years in terms of voting the same. And then the Senate majority. So many things in the Senate have to be passed on a super majority of 60 votes. So that's still stuff where Democrats will be needed. And yeah, to kind of go a little bit deeper into the politics, there's kind of two things that are kind of make this a little bit more complicated. So first of all, one of the great things about the Inflation Reduction Act in terms of political economy is that 80% of the Inflation Reduction Act's benefits actually accrue to red districts, to Republican districts. So a lot of Republican legislators are cross-pressured between like ideological demands and orientation and kind of their narrow economic interests. So that's a reason that complicates the story. And we have already seen effects of that and other factors. So like 10 House Republicans, which would arguably be more than the current margin in the House, signed a letter in support of parts of the Inflation Reduction Act. So that's kind of reasons to maybe be a little bit more on the hopeful side. There's also reasons, other reasons, so competition with China, industrial policy, and increasing energy demand. Those reasons all push kind of towards policy that's focused on continued energy investment, right? There's going to be more more policy support for dirty energy probably, but that doesn't mean that clean energy investments will all be scrapped, because adding clean energy is also adding energy, kind of informing an energy abundance or an energy dominance agenda. So those are kind of also reasons to be more on the hopeful side. But on the other hand, like fiscal constraints are very real, right? So like if you want to pass large tax cuts, you have to cut something. And Trump has obviously also been campaigning against the green energy scam. There's a lot of ideological opposition, which also looms large. So I think the key takeaways here is like to be very clear, this is like a worse scenario than had we had a Harris scenario. It's also a worse scenario than had there been a split government, but it's kind of hard to say, or there's still a lot of uncertainty for how things might go. Yeah, with that all being said, this kind of sets the scene. What is the political environment in which climate philanthropy will be operating in over the next 4 years? Now let's actually go about like what can climate philanthropists do? One obvious strategy, of course, if you're in a coin toss election, so before the election, and you're observing there's a very real chance that someone with a very anti-climate agenda will win the election, one strategy one might pursue is to say, okay, if you kind of look at climate philanthropy and the partisanship of climate philanthropy, it's kind of very left focused, right? So like essentially all of climate philanthropy, or like more than 90% of climate philanthropy in the US is kind of targeting left of center groups. So this is something that's kind of obvious and kind of I think relates very clearly to how EAs think about things. In a situation like this, you might want to support climate groups on the political right. And this imbalance is not only a statistic, right? I mean, you can also really see it. So I've spent the last week in Washington, D.C. visiting different grantees, and it's been very obvious that kind of grantees working on climate right of center are often like extremely constrained in ways that the peers on the left are not in terms of financially constrained. So this is something very real. And surely ahead of an election, a coin toss election, you would expect that everyone is kind of adjusting to this, because politics overall, US politics is moving to the right. That was very predictable. It was very predictable that Trump might win the election and that he might have a trifecta. So you would expect, and in fact, we did expect that a lot of people would react to this, that kind of funding to right of center climate groups, the eco-right, would increase strongly over the course of the year. Unfortunately, this is not what we've been seeing. So the funding is like there's very few people that have kind of ramped up their funding in light of this election. We have really done this. So over the last year, we've been deploying about 9 million to climate groups, right of center, in different tranches, kind of always expecting, okay, soon everyone will also do this, and it kind of never happens. So we've kind of made 3 grants over the past 12 months together, about 9 million, and supporting 20+ organizations working on climate right of center. This includes groups in DC, but also includes state work and kind of both think tanks and kind of work that's strengthening climate coalitions on the ground. And we've been doing this by working with Deploy US, which is a strategic regranter and field builder. So that's what we've been doing. The reason we're doing that, or the potential that we're seeing, is essentially enabling credible side actor right of centers that develop a Republican perspective on climate. And ultimately, the goal is to inform, guide, and encourage Republican lawmakers who want to act on climate and clean energy, right? And if we're kind of remembering the slide from a couple of slides ago on like the political economy, essentially it's about ensuring a situation where everyone who has incentives to be pro-climate actually has a political backing and also has the interest to do so, and making the best out of this situation, which will undoubtedly be challenging, more challenging than other scenarios would have been. We should also be realistic. So this is not a cure-all strategy, right? So I've talked a lot about the international impacts of Trump's re-election, like the whole signaling, of, okay, we have right-wing anti-climate populism that will have effects globally, even if climate policy does not get repealed. And of course, foreign policy is kind of pretty much in the hands of the president alone, not really affectable by congressional Republicans. And of course, it's also a medium-term proposition. So we're not wanting to suggest that like you can just like throw money kind of in right of center groups and you will see impact directly. So yeah, want to be realistic here. With that being said, I'm handing over to Stan, who will talk about another strategy we've been thinking about and executing on.
Hey, I'm Stan, and I'm an applied researcher on the climate team here at Founders Pledge. Yeah, I've been looking at geographical diversification. So Johannes has talked a bit about diversification within the US, political diversification. Basically, it's a response to risk. We don't want all of our eggs in the same basket. And there is this question post-Trump's election as president: is the US now a less attractive place for climate investment, and should we be focusing more on other regions? And this is a surprisingly complex question. I think it's not difficult to see that this development is going to be bad for the US and its climate innovation capacity. The Inflation Reduction Act was a game changer. It's injected billions of dollars and is injecting billions of dollars into sort of seeding some of the future top clean energy technologies. And revoking that policy is going to be, again, a game changer, and may mean that other regions become relatively more attractive for our investment. But of course, this is US politics, and what Trump does in this election is going to have reverberations around the world. And it's possible that other countries will respond as well. We might see leaders mimicking Trump, or just a diminishing of climate ambition around the world. Or conversely, we might see sort of a negative correlation effect where other regions step up to fill the gap left by a retreating US. So I've spent a lot of time since the election kind of exploring this question of regional correlation. Been looking at Europe, where there's signs that there's definitely hope that Europe will sort of pick up the baton of climate leadership, but there's quite a lot of reasons to be skeptical that this will happen. I mean, the stock market has not been kind on European clean energy stocks. And although we've heard some noises from officials that Europe's going to sort of step up and be the global leader in climate ambition, it's not a great time for Europe to do that. Climate is less popular as a political issue than it was in 2016, and Europe's going through sort of some economic doldrums right now. It's got other big problems. It's got Ukraine and what to do with Ukraine now that Trump will presumably be much less supportive. But of course, I think overall the picture is that although there might be some positive correlation with what's happening in the US, we might see some diminishment of European innovation capacity. It's probably not going to be as strong as what's happening in the US. After all, Europe's leaders have not all changed overnight. They're not talking about U-turns and pulling out of agreements. So I think our overall impression is that we might expect some positive correlation within Europe, but certainly not as strong as the US. I've also been looking at China, where similarly, we've got the kind of de facto impression that, say, the US pulling out of Paris will lower the bar for climate ambition. It'll be more difficult to pressure China to sort of do difficult things in the name of climate if the US is not at the negotiation table. However, China can't back down completely. We've seen really surprising levels of investment in China in mature clean energy technology, which has made China the undisputed world leader of clean energy these days. It's producing 80% of the world's solar panels, 80% of our lithium batteries, about 60% of wind turbines, and 58% of EVs. Essentially, China has gambled on trying to be the world leader in what it sees as a clean energy, which is what it sees as a critical industry of the 21st century. And it probably can't go back on that. There's even the possibility that US pulling away and basically relinquishing its sort of stake on being a world leader in clean energy, that might mean that China pushes even harder to sell its wares in the global south. If it can't sell to the US, maybe it will push sort of green soft power, this idea that it can gain diplomatically by helping clean energy spread around the world. But I think still we've got that top line effect that overall we might see this US pulling away from climate ambition will have rippling effects around the world, and we expect perhaps some positive correlation in China also. This isn't really coming as a shock to us. I mean, we've been thinking about this for a long time. This slide comes from last year, where we've been tracking something called innovation capacity. When we look at interventions in the US, they are often things to do with innovation, to do with policy, tech leadership. And now we're thinking with the potential dismantling of the Inflation Reduction Act and other climate policy, we're thinking that other places might be a better place for innovation interventions. So we've been sort of going back to this model and thinking about how things have changed now that we've observed the election result. Overall, we're kind of thinking, right, first of all, how much is this affecting the US? Is the US, how much less attractive is the US now for innovation interventions? And how is this change correlated? Is it positively or negatively correlated in other regions? Once we put that together, we can think about how does this change our prioritization? Are we going to put more effort now into exploring opportunities in other regions? So in our model, which I will not go into in detail here, we sort of plug in these uncertain variables, which include correlation. Here we've got an idea of how that might look, where we perhaps put a lot of probability mass between 0 and 1 correlation for the different regions. And we put that together, we can see how our prioritization might look different before and after the US election. On the next slide, you'll see the top chart there. Well, on the horizontal axis, we have this regional innovation multiplier. And you can see in the top chart in red, the US looks like the more attractive option. In many of our simulations, it's higher. It's got a higher innovation multiplier than Europe. Post-election, when we've observed the result, as Johannes was talking about, Republican trifecta, Trump as president, things don't look too good. We expect some dismantling of policy. We see that US's innovation multiplier has got much lower. But we also see that the blue chart, the European modifier, has also moved to the left. That's the positive correlation at play. But overall, we see sort of US being quite a clear, more promising target to a bit more of a close race. Now, importantly here, this uncertainty that we see is correlated, right? You know, if things are looking bad in the US and Europe is correlated, then the uncertainty there is linked. So what I'm trying to visualize here is before the election, you could see that in a majority of our simulations, the US seemed like a more promising region for innovation investment. Post-election, it's more 50-50. In about half of our outcomes and half of our simulations, Europe has higher innovation capacity. So that's just a whistle-stop tour of what I've been looking at this week. And it's important to note that this is not the full picture. Fine, US, relatively speaking, looks less promising for innovation. I've been looking at other regions around the world, not just EU and China, but also comparing US federal level, which is what looks worse now with a Republican president, with the US state level, where we still have a lot of Democratic governors and even Republican governors who want to keep this clean energy investment in their state. And of course, regions elsewhere in the world. It's important to note that this is just one side of the equation, right? The innovation capacity of the US may have gone down, but we might expect funders to respond to this. And we might see climate philanthropy now flowing to non-US regions as people think that under Trump, the US is no longer an attractive target. So really, we have to put these two things together to get the kind of answer of whether we should prioritize the US less or more. I'm going to pass you now back to Johannes.
Yeah, thank you, Stan. Okay, so yeah, we're close to the end. Just want to wrap up with some broader lessons. So until now, you might have been wondering why this presentation is called On the Hedge. Excuse me. And the reason is really, when we were thinking about why this has happened, what we've been thinking a lot about, or been inspired by this book by Nate Silver, On the Edge. We're just kind of introducing a typology of two different elites. On the one hand, you have the liberal establishment, Harvard, New York Times, etc., characterized by progressive politics, characterized by risk aversion, by caution, and by a collective or like group-oriented mode of decision-making. On the other hand, you have the river, people thinking in expected value, people that kind of tend to be contrarian, people that tend to take risks, that have a betting mindset, that are also worried about foregone opportunities. So like they're not risk averse, they're kind of worried about risks not taken. Also that are decoupling, that are treating different issues separately rather than kind of related to one political axis, and that are often very individualist. So those are kind of two different elite clusters that I think arguably kind of a pretty good mapping in terms of understanding how you ask elites are kind of thinking about it. And yeah, I think one key insight really is that most climate philanthropists live in the village, right? So there's often risk aversion, there's often coupling climate with positions of grantees that grantees might have on other issues, right? So that if you're kind of like you might not want to support an organization out of center because that you're not kind of, even if they're working on climate, because they're not aligned with all of your other positions, and yeah, so they're not aligned with progressive politics. And actions that are obvious for effective altruists that are often kind of, or EA adjacent people that are often kind of living on the river, such as thinking in terms of expected value, hedging bets, being prepared for a range of options, are actually really underprovided in climate philanthropy, right? Because there are few people that are thinking along those lines that are kind of doing philanthropy. And yeah, I think another aspect is that philanthropy is not an efficient market, right? So individual donors represent 2/3 of climate philanthropy that are kind of, so yeah, that are probably not thinking very strategically about what shall we do before an election. It's kind of much more individual giving every year at the end of the year. Obviously, most climate donors have a strong lean a lot towards Democrats, and might not be really interested in kind of funding stuff right of center, or kind of thinking about what might happen in a Republican scenario. So there's kind of all kinds of incentives in that direction. And then foundations that I think will often act more strategically, but they're often acting in ways that are very slow, that take many years. So this kind of, what does this mean? Like, it means that essentially we should not expect that most philanthropists price in publicly available information in a way that efficient markets mostly do, right? And so I think this is something that we have certainly gotten wrong over the course of this year, because essentially we've been escalating our grants, kind of investing right of center, because we've been thinking it many times, okay, soon everyone will kind of fund this, because it's kind of becoming obvious that we're probably at least in a 50-50 situation, right? I mean, at times it looked much more clear. But this has very much not happened, right? So it's kind of, and I would kind of wager that EAs probably often overestimate the degree to which philanthropists act kind of strategically in this forward-looking manner. So I think it's an important lesson also for philanthropists, EA-aligned philanthropists in other areas, not only in climate. And yeah, robustness and anticipation are fairly rare. So those are some anonymous and slightly paraphrased quotes, but they're real quotes. So yeah, one quote here. After the election, I got so many messages from people who forgot that I existed. This is from a leader of an eco-right organization. And of course, we knew something the day after the election, but like, be modest, right? So like we came from a coin flip to a certainty. So like if you're kind of thinking about the future and bets, then not that much was revealed the day after the election, and you would have like, yeah, maybe acted more earlier, because acting earlier has lots of benefits in terms of scaling capacity, in terms of taking advantage. Yeah, another quote that kind of goes in a similar direction. Everyone got interviewed to provide priorities for the Harris trifecta. So the scenario, which is the most opposite of the actual scenario where Harris would have controlled the presidency and Democrats would have controlled both houses of Congress. This never really had a probability of more than 10% or so. So, but it's still kind of the scenario that climate philanthropists prepared for intensely. Yeah, so donors that act in anticipation can have a large impact, I think, is the key lesson here. And to conclude, yeah, the too long didn't listen here. The impact of the US elections will obviously be an uphill battle. The scenario is the most challenging scenario you can think of for climate. So like, should be honest about that. But there are narrow majorities and there are mixed incentives for Republicans. So the situation is more uncertain. It's not an everything situation. If you remember the chart with Hillary Clinton, kind of this very strong kind of certainty about the difference in the past that this probably exaggerated. It's not an everything is lost situation. There's a lot that might happen and a lot that we can also contribute to positively. Philanthropic response strategies, we talked about 2 strategies. Depolarizing climate is an obvious but underappreciated strategy. So this is kind of investing right of center, kind of leading to a more balanced climate civil society ecosystem. There's more to be done. There's still kind of funding gaps that to me look extreme if I'm honest, like if I kind of compare this to what I'm seeing in other fields of climate philanthropy. Geographical diversification is an obvious response. It's also a response we expect philanthropists to take because they took it in 2016, 2017. But the correlations, yeah, kind of model the picture. Yeah, and the broader lessons, by and large, few philanthropic actors, at least in climate, kind of prepare, or if they do, it's kind of not very visible how they do that. And many more philanthropic actors are reacting. Yeah, I guess to really conclude, the Climate Fund is really, your contributions to the Climate Fund is really what has enabled us to kind of make ambitious bets to meet the moment, right? So what I've talked about earlier, kind of acting in preparation, acting as a hedge, but also as a general kind of balancing strategy. This has been made possible by many of you that are on this call, so thank you. Contributing to the Climate Fund ensures that dollars are allocated in light of how the environment changes. So we're trying to analyze how does the political environment change, how does philanthropy change, and we're making the best bets given what we can know. We can give to the Climate Fund at giving what we can. Other recommendations. So in general, the Climate Fund is our top recommendations, but if you're kind of more interested in supporting individual organizations, here are our top recommendations. Everyone can see the slides later. But we have recommendations targeting the US, targeting the EU, and then some other recent grantees. And yeah, we also have a lot of updates that you can kind of read about more. We wrote an entire report, which much of this presentation is based on. Before the election, we're going to post a post-election update, which will be cross-posting on the EA forum. And yeah, all resources are collected at founderspledge.com/climate. And with that, I just want to thank everyone for your attention, for your support, and yeah, leave it open for questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for that talk. It was great. We already have some on swap cards, so I'll jump right in. Johannes, could you elaborate on what you meant by like right versus center or left of center, like in the context of climate stuff? Like what I guess are right of center groups like kind of working on, and how is this like differing? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, there's something that's called like Big Green. So in the US, right? So like the very large environmental organization, the Sierra Club, the National Resource Defense Council. Those are kind of left of center organizations that are having budgets in the hundreds of millions. Right of center organizations working on climate would be organizations like the American Conservation Coalition, which is kind of a small organization. I mean, all eco-right organizations are small because they've been very funding constrained. The Conservative Energy Institute, Conservative Energy Network would be another one. R Street Institute, Clear Path. So there's kind of many kind of smaller organizations.
Yeah. What are like the big policy ways, I guess they're differing or something? Like what would be like policies that center right organizations are like kind of looking for or like trying to promote on the Hill? Yeah.
What the difference is in terms of policy priorities? Is that the question?
Yeah, or like
Yeah.
do you have examples?
Yeah. So no, certainly. So I mean, there will be different priorities, right? So like one thing I've already mentioned is like, so Republicans and Republican climate groups in general also will will be pretty interested in permitting reform, something that many left of center climate or groups are opposed, even though it's kind of clear that this will have emissions benefits. Other issues So I think oftentimes Republican climate groups will be more innovation focused, kind of emphasizing climate as a global problem more. That's a situation where Republican climate groups, I think, are kind of more aligned with the emissions math. Things that they will be in general, I mean, this is and I'm not speaking as I'm not a person kind of representing any of these organizations. I'm just giving you my impressions, but like things that will generally be less emphasized as kind of details and kind of terms of like tax credits. I mean, I think probably like less kind of focused on, and lifestyle changes are certainly less focused on. So it's kind of a different solution set, and it certainly looks different, right? So like a Republican climate group will probably be more in favor of pushing also like enhancing kind of policies to support natural gas, for example, right? That kind of left of center climate groups.
Yeah, that all makes sense. Thank you. Yeah, for either of you, over like the next 4 years, I know I guess it's like a bit early to be guessing this, but where would you like venture the most impactful like areas to invest in climate advocacy will be? So like US, EU, India, China, like etc. Yeah. I know you talked a bit about this at the talk, but yeah.
I think the only honest answer here has to be like it's too early to tell. So I mean, as I mentioned, I've just spent the last week kind of in DC trying to get a picture, trying to talk to lots of people, lots of the organizations, but it's I mean, I think no one knows at this point because no one knows how the rest of the world will react. I mean, the energy secretary was literally only announced yesterday, right? We don't know how Trump 2 will look like. So I think it will be less clear than the tweet from that Hillary Clinton retweeted suggested, like in which case you would kind of definitely divest from the US. But it's also, yeah, it's really too hard to tell. Yeah.
Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah, I guess like when maybe this is more for Stan, but when you like go about simulating these sorts of things, like what factors are you like yeah, how are you going about modeling this?
Well, obviously it's early days, and the stuff I was showing is really just our first impressions. So what this means is kind of looking at high quality news stories and analysis. We're just trying to get early signals for things like our politicians making really strongly worded statements about their sort of commitment to climate after the election, and same for kind of green organizations. I think just to pick those examples, what I noticed is that we generally didn't see leaders and nonprofits making really strong statements after the election. We saw people kind of cozying up to the president-elect, and I don't think that necessarily means these countries, leaders, and organizations don't care about the climate. I think it's just political calculation to be in the good books of the new president. But that's, these are kind of early signs that we can look for now. Unfortunately, what we prefer is hard data, like actual policy changes, but there hasn't been time for those changes to ripple through. Obviously, COP29 last week is actually quite fertile ground for seeing sort of statements and intent. But I think it's worth emphasizing that right now we are just putting our fingers in the wind and seeing, getting the first impressions of what is and isn't happening. And I think what I was sort of saying about Europe and China is we definitely haven't seen anyone standing up and saying, I will take the baton. We will make these difficult decisions. You might have hoped that from the leaders of France and Germany, but they both happen to be in very politically sort of fragile situations right now. So one thing we can't say is that everything's going to be fine.
Yeah, I guess. Sorry. Oh, sorry.
If I can add one small thing there, right? So like what Stan was talking about is the correlation. I mean, the innovation capacity at large, like that we've kind of shown that's kind of based on a reanalysis of ITF data. So that's kind of based on our data. Right?
Cool. Yeah, I guess so. Like besides just like statements from elected leaders, are there kind of signals or other things you'll be looking at in the next few months to get a sense of how things are moving?
Well, I can give a brief answer. I mean, I'll be following what's happening, what's being talked about by Trump and around Trump. I think everyone's waiting to see whether a lot of his his stated policies or stated positions are actually going to materialize. So particularly on tariffs, when we're talking about China, he's talked about sort of 60 or higher percentage tariffs on China. That would be huge, and I think there'll be such a large shift. It's very difficult to predict what would happen, but it would be a big change, and for example, could significantly increase the cost of clean energy infrastructure in the US and elsewhere. Yes.
Yeah, and we're looking at appointments, right, or kind of nominations of appointments, and also like a lot of this will happen really early in the Trump administration. I mean, that's also a reason why the best time to invest is now, and the second best time to invest was the story goes the other. The best time to invest was a year ago or more, and now it's the second best time, because a lot of the policy development will be front loaded, because the Trump tax cuts are such a huge kind of policy window when it comes to the Inflation Reduction Act. Yeah, so we'll be looking at that very, very closely.
Yeah. Sorry. A follow-up question from the chat is, do either of you have thoughts about how Elon Musk's involvement with the Trump administration is going to affect climate change, or Republican stances on climate advocacy?
Yeah, this is the biggest X factor for me, the biggest factor of uncertainty, also because it's kind of relatively recent, right? So I mean, Elon Musk only became really so Trump focused 3 months ago. And so Trump has always been campaigning as being very skeptical of the electric vehicle tax credits. If you would have made a guess 4 months ago, which tax credits will definitely not survive if Trump wins the election, it would have been those for electric cars. It obviously kind of interesting to see how this interacts with what Elon Musk will prioritize. But in general, this seems like an extreme source of uncertainty, and also people I talked to last week couldn't really make sense of it, because it seems very hard to predict, because it's very much politics that depends on very few individuals that might also not act in line with their narrow interests. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, do either of you have a sense of, or a guess on how likely the Paris Accords are to be abandoned or backed out of, and how donors are maybe it would be best for them to react if that happens?
Yeah. So I think the Paris Agreement, I mean, the US will probably leave. I think it's the cost for leaving is very low for Trump, and he's very clear that he wants to do this, and he did it before. I mean, I think other countries will not abandon the Paris Agreement, because the Paris Agreement is essentially a voluntary agreement to do something and to do what you're self-committing. So there's not really a strong reason for other countries to leave, but it's certainly lowering the ambition. I don't think that's something that philanthropists can affect. I think this is something that philanthropists should kind of take as the external environment, and should kind of pursue strategies that are more robust to this, right? So one of the reasons that we've been focusing heavily on let's say innovation advocacy, or generally kind of building up domestic pressures to pursue policy, is because we don't think that you can control the international environment, and we also don't think that ultimately the Paris Agreement has that much force either way. So yeah, I think the best response is to live with it and make bets that are good even under weak international climate policy.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so in your talk, you talk about kind of how a lot of investment ends up being reactive rather than proactive. Are there kind of, for the next election, or if you could redo this election cycle over, what would be the big things you would have changed, or will be looking to focus on for the next election?
I mean, I wish we'd done more. So I mean, we could have done more, or more earlier. We still did much more than other philanthropists in terms of preparing, but I wish we'd done more, and I wish we'd not been thinking so much in the EA ways of thinking of how our other philanthropists behave, right? So yeah, I think that's the big lesson here. I think forward looking, Essentially, it makes sense to always think 2 years ahead. So maybe it's kind of time to fund stuff that's kind of geared towards Democrats taking the House majority in 2026 and kind of thinking what will happen then. Yeah, and looking at other similarly consequential elections. I mean, I think the one reason we focus on this election is because the US election has outsized importance because climate is so polarized and the US matters so much. Yeah, but I think in general, just to tie this back to our general strategy and systematic risk reduction, which was in the title, but we didn't really explain in the talk, right? Like in general, this is very much what we're trying to prioritize always, which is like acting in ways that work when the future doesn't go optimally. So that's the reason why we focus so much on neglected technologies that will be useful, and why we focus on a political scenario that is not our preferred political scenario, and similar actions. So it ties together in this way.
Yeah. Do you have like any concrete examples of things you would have funded if you'd like taken this approach that you ended up not funding?
I mean, so like we've mostly worked through, so like we kind of mostly work with the re-grantor for those grants, like for the specific organizations with Deploy US, but we probably, like in an ideal world, we would have moved some of our donations forward in time, and maybe increased them. Yeah.
I think it's worth bragging a bit more though, than pointing out that most of our recent grants have gone to eco-right organizations, which is kind of unique, I think, in our field. So in a way, this election outcome kind of indicates those bets that we made. Obviously, it could have gone either way, and Democrats getting the next presidency wouldn't necessarily have invalidated our reasoning. But I think overall, our last couple of years, our main emphasis has been on political diversification, and I think that's paying off.
Yeah. Sorry. Do you think it would be better to, or good to invest more in it just seems like the difference in funding for right organizations versus left organizations is like so stark that I could like imagine it's good to do, even like in a situation where it's more mixed on like the political makeup. Do either of you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So like, I mean, we made this, like the investments were not only like hedging as a part of the motivation, but like another part of the motivation is also like you cannot have a durable policy regime for climate, which you definitely need, because all of the climate policies in the US right now, their effectiveness depends on them being in place for 10 years at least, right? It's kind of so in that sense, like this would have been we made the bet in realization of the probabilities, which included 50% Harris win. And I don't think we would have said this would have been a bad investment under those circumstances, because like even if Harris had won, then certainly the 2026 midterm elections would have delivered a conservative outcome. And so yeah, so it's not fully dependent on one election outcome or another. This is an imbalance that needs to be fixed. It's also an imbalance that holds in many other countries. So we're in conversations of commissioning a study on this, which kind of looks at how does this imbalance look in other jurisdictions, and what should climate philanthropists prioritize. Also, I think what we talked about, the international effects, right? Because what happens in the US is kind of not constrained to the US, also in terms of like its broader ideological implications of which voices or which perspectives are being amplified in other countries.
Yeah. Just quickly, I think a question from the chat is like the fact that like political power can switch back and forth so quickly and like on relatively short timescales. Does this kind of have implications for long-term climate strategy?
I think this is sort of very high level, but it's clearly not desirable to have climate as a partisan issue for the reasons Johannes just mentioned. To make progress, things need to work across long timescales. So yeah, I think that is a worry that I have, that especially in the US, climate's highly politicized and polarized. Ideally, we need to fix that if we're going to make consistent progress towards all these net zero goals.
I think something to add there in addition to that is that, I mean, for the US context at least, right, the majority switch, but it's almost always true that most significant policy happens in a bipartisan fashion in the political middle, right? So like even if Harris had won, like in 80% of the Harris wins, she would have had a Republican Senate. So I think that for the US, this is a special thing about the US. This is different, say in the UK, for example. But like for the US, I think it just means there's generally a premium on organizations and policies that work in a bipartisan setting, right? And I think that's, I mean, we didn't talk about this organization today because we've talked about it a lot in the past, but I mean, Clean Air Task Force is like a good example of an organization that has like long worked with people along the aisle.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you both so much for your presentation. And I hope everyone else has a great rest of the conference.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.